Okay, so we're doing a demonstration today that we call Truth About Set Screws. We're going to be installing two different clamps with two different types of set screws and seeing what it actually does to the seam when you install. The manufacturer of this clamp that uses round tip set screws, they claim that their set screws only dimple the panel and never breach the paint, and that cup tip set screws tear through the panel and void warranties and all that. So we're basically just going to install both clamps with two different types of set screws, and we just want to show everybody what each clamp does to the seam. So what we're using here is a typical commercially available 24 gauge snap lock panel. These panels can be found at pretty much any roll former. Very popular panel. The manufacturer of this clamp recommends 130 to 150 inch-pounds of torque, and the manufacturer of this cup tip set screw in this clamp recommends 90 inch-pounds of torque for this cup tip set screw. The reason this is a lower torque recommendation is the cup tip actually grabs the panel in a different way, and it doesn't require so much torque and so much pressure on the seam. And you'll see the difference in how the seam looks once the clamps are installed. So we'll install them both, and then we will remove the clamps and show you what the seam looks like underneath. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're installing the stainless steel clamp with opposing cup tip set screws. These only need to be torqued to 90 inch-pounds. So you'll see it's a lot less pressure. There's very little seam deformity. It really doesn't affect anything inside the seam because you're only going to 90 inch-pounds. Okay, so we'll just put it about the same distance back. Now, another advantage to this clamp is you can preload, because you're using opposing set screws, you can preload one of the screws to already be halfway across the seam. So basically that way you only have to tighten one screw. So it just goes on like that. I'm just going to snug it up. And then we have our torque wrench actually set at 90 inch-pounds already. Now there's 90 right there. So, one thing you notice is if you look closely at the seam basically looks like it looked before we installed the clamp. And the other thing, if you can get in closer with the camera, you can see around these set screws, before we take the clamp off, you can see exactly what the clamp touches and doesn't touch. There's no scratches. There's no exposed bare metal. The manufacturer of the other clamp, he's basically been telling the public that these cup tip set screws expose bare metal to the elements. And you can see right here, this is a properly installed clamp, torqued to 90 inch-pounds, and there is no exposed metal to the elements. So let's remove it and we'll show you how this clamp stays in place at only 90 inch-pounds of torque. Okay, so the secret is to the cup tip set screws, they permanently lock to the panel. So once they're installed, they should be never taken off. But basically this is where your set screws were, and this is how it stays in place. So the cup tip creates a positive attachment point. It doesn't breach the metal, it doesn't cut through the metal, but it creates a spot, what we call an anchor point. And the tip of the set screw is always over this point. Therefore, none of the bare metal in the anchor point is exposed to the elements. It's always sealed. So that's why the cup tip set screws only require 90 inch-pounds of torque. Okay, so today we're demonstrating the installation of the RC clamp on a 24 gauge snap lock seam, very typical seam that you'd find pretty much anywhere around the country. So the RC is the perfect size for this seam. They also make a larger clamp called the RCT. Both of them have 3 set screws. They use cup tip set screws. The nice thing about the 3 set screws is you can preload 2 of them already halfway across the clamp. So that way you're really only having to torque 1 set screw, which makes these extremely fast to install and extremely strong once they're in place. So we're going to demonstrate that right now. So we'll just set this RCT aside right now. And so manufacturer's recommendation is you only have to torque these cup tip set screws to 90 inch-pounds. The other nice thing about this clamp is because it has this wide throat, a lot of clamps out there on the market, they make a lot of different models to fit every different shape and size of clamp out there. These are universal fit clamps. So because of this wide throat, they basically will top load out over just about any seam out there. The only thing these really won't fit is a trapezoidal seam, but most everything else. And the beauty of it is you only have to tighten 1 set screw, you only have to go to 90 inch-pounds, and you never have to panel feed. You can top load right over the seam at the attachment point, as opposed to having to go down to the end of the run and slide it up in place, which scratches the seam. And the paint finish on these panels is, it scratches very, very easily. So that's a couple of huge advantages for this RC clamp. But so let's just do a quick install. Very, very simple. We're only going to go to 90 inch-pounds as per manufacturer's recommendation. And we've got our torque wrench here set to 90 inch-pounds. So as you look around, if you look around the attachment points, you'll see there's no exposed metal. No part of the clamp has scratched any part of the seam on both sides. So this is a properly installed clamp using cup tip set screws and properly torqued to 90 inch-pounds. You can see there's very little, if any, seam deformity. And then the next thing we're going to do is remove it and show you how these set screws attach to the panel. So basically this is the side that had the 2 set screws. So it's real simple. These, as you torque from the other side, these are pulled towards the panel, and the tip of the set screw nests right in that little circle area. And these clamps are designed to be permanently mounted to this roof, so basically that area is permanently sealed between the tip of the screw and the seam itself. If you switch over here to the other side, same thing over here. This is what we call the positive attachment point, and it's right between the tip of the set screw and the seam itself. So these set screws do not cut through the metal. They embed into the paint. And then you can see right here, as you move this, you can hear it actually catch in place. That's the secret to these set screws. It's locking in place on that seam when it's properly installed for the life of the roof. So it will always be there. So you can see all around the tip of that set screw, there's no scratches, there's nothing that's going to expose this panel to premature corrosion. And that's basically the secret to cup tip set screws. The demonstration we're doing today, we're using a 24 gauge snap lock panel, and we're using 3 of the U-clamps with round tip set screws. The reason we're using these clamps on this particular panel, as you can see right here, I have 3 different torque settings. So when this company tested their clamps, they tested at 115 inch-pounds for this gauge panel. In their installation instructions, they recommend, for 24 gauge, they recommend that the screws be torqued from 130 to 150 inch-pounds. So what we're doing is we're going to install 3 of the exact same clamp. These are all the U clamps. I'm going to install 3 different clamps, one to what they tested at, one to the low end, and one to the high end of what they recommend. And then we're going to come back, remove the clamps, and we're going to see, what we want to see is when those set screws push through and they've been breaching the paint on the opposite side of the seam, we want to see if there's a certain torque setting that's happening, or if it happens on all of them. That's really all we're testing for with this one. So right now we're going to do install all 3 and then remove all 3, and then we'll look, and you can see the seams are brand new on both sides. And we'll keep the camera rolling through the entire thing. We'll just fast forward through the installation and the removal, and then we'll discuss how the installation point looks. So we've installed our clamps, and we have now removed them as carefully as possible. So let's start right here. This is the 115 inch-pounds. You can see that the paint is breached on both set screws. This is the manufacturer of this clamp with these round point set screws. This is actually the torque setting that they tested at. So it's 115. Then in their installation instructions, for some reason they tested at 115, but now they recommend 130 to 150 inch-pounds of torque. So this is the low end of what they recommend, and you can see right here that the paint is breached here and here. And then as you get to the higher end, the 150, same thing. Of course, scratches across the top of the seam, that's from the body of the clamp. As these set screws at these high torque settings push through, there's a dimple on this side, but it blows out the metal on this side. It stretches the metal. This silver ring, that's where the paint does not stretch. The paint actually cracks around those. So you get about a half, it's breached about halfway around at 115, and then you can see the body of the clamp not only deforms the seam, but also removes the paint. And it gets progressively worse at 130, and then at 150 you can see the rings are almost all the way around. And then the clamp body does a little more scratching as well. So 115 inch-pounds, 130, 150, and this is all with the U-clamp. Okay, so what we're doing for this demonstration is we're going to be installing this aluminum clamp utilizing 2 stainless steel round tip set screws. This clamp is it's a very common clamp, commonly referred to as the U-clamp. The seam that we're installing is a very common 24 gauge snap lock panel, pretty much available anywhere. This manufacturer claims that they have a specially designed round tip set screw that will not gall the paint, scratch the paint, or in any way harm the seam. So we're going to put that to the test today. They also warn against attaching anything to the seam that's going to overly deform the seam or distort the seam. So we're also going to test that. So as we're installing this clamp, pay particular attention to if it changes the look of the seam, otherwise known as seam distortion. So Manufacturer's recommendation is 130 to 150 inch-pounds, so today we're going to be going to right at 147. So the first thing we're going to do is snug these set screws up with our gun. We've got our torque wrench here set to 147 inch-pounds. Go. So one thing you'll notice is the seam distortion. So this is properly installed, properly torqued, and you can see the seam distortion right here. And then the next thing we're going to do is actually remove this clamp, and we're going to test their claim that their set screws do not scratch the paint, gall the paint, or in any way damage the seam, which we can already see seam distortion here. So let's back these set screws out. So the results here are very consistent. We've done this test many times, and this is a very typical result of round tip set screws. And what you have is this is actually where the two set screws press into the panel. This is what this manufacturer refers to as slight dimpling. You can see it actually does remove the paint down to bare metal. The body of the clamp also exposes bare metal here. You can see the scratches. This was a brand new seam. And if you come around here to the other side, this is what's most interesting, because as these two set screws press through, they dimple on this side and they stretch the metal out. This is pushed out. The metal stretches, but the paint never stretches. So this is very consistent that you get this breach right here around these, the opposite side of the dimple, I guess you could call this area. So you can see this silver ring right here. That is where the paint has stretched and breached down to bare metal. Then you can also see the body of the clamp has scratched all the way down to bare metal, all the way along the bottom here. So once again, this manufacturer with round tip set screws claims that their special set screws are specially designed to protect the paint finish. So you can see they've exposed bare metal on both sides and the top of the seam and breached it right here as the set screws press through. This is a properly installed and properly torqued screw on a very common 24 gauge snap lock panel. Okay, so for the next demonstration, what we're doing is we've talked to the distributors of this product, and they say that we're being told that either of these two clamps will work on this panel. So whether that's right or wrong, we're just going to test both clamps. We've already done, this is the U clamp, this is the S clamp. Basically about the same size. The U clamp has, you can put set screws in from either side, and it has these little hooks at the bottom of the throat. When the S clamp doesn't have those little hooks. It's more just a straight drop over clamp. It has a little bit wider opening down here. So we've already tested this one numerous times. This still is an aluminum clamp with stainless steel round tip set screws. We're still testing it for the same thing, to see if the set screws in any way protect the paint finish, and to see how this deforms the seam, to see if it does so as badly as the U clamp deformed the seam. So we'll install that, and it's still 130 to 150 inch-pounds of torque. So we're going to gonna be going to 147 inch-pounds, which is exactly the same torque setting that we did on the U-clamp. So, on the U-clamp demonstration, we saw quite a bit of seam deformity because it does have that little hook at the bottom on the inside of the throat. This one doesn't have that hook, so it's still a pretty good amount of seam deformity, but not nearly as bad as the U-clamp. So, once again, this is the S-clamp. Same torque setting, same panel. It's a 24 gauge, commercially available snap lock panel. And this is installed on, this is mounted down to this board. There is a clip right here, so we're not installing over a clip location. And now we're gonna remove it, and we're gonna see what it looks like underneath. Now once again, this manufacturer, this clamp claims that they have a special round tip set screw that does not in any way hurt the seam. It doesn't scratch the panel, gall the panel, or expose any raw metal to the element. So that's what we're testing. So what you see here, this is actually the site where the round tip set screws press into the panel. So you can see that right here, this set screw has actually galled the paint down to bare metal. The body of the clamp has scratched the top of the seam. This is down to bare metal. You can see the seam deformity that's left. The seam is sort of C-shaped. And then what you get on this other side, this is very common. We see this on just about every properly installed clamp that we test with the round tip set screws. What we see is, first of all, the body of the clamp actually scratches down to bare metal all the way around. And what happens is these set screws push through, just like on the other clamp. This metal stretches and the paint doesn't stretch. So there's actually a silver ring all the way around each one of these dimples where the paint is breached, because it will not stretch. The metal will stretch, the paint won't. But you can see the silver all the way around each of those, and that is exposed to the elements. Okay, so now in this demonstration, we've actually switched panels. Now we're on a heavy duty panel. This is a 22 gauge snap lock panel. We're using the S clamp, which is an aluminum clamp with stainless steel round point set screws. When you go to the 22 gauge, this manufacturer says the set screws should be torqued between 160 and 180 inch-pounds, and that his special round point set screws will not scratch the paint, gall the material, they protect the paint, it won't deform the seam in any way. So that's what we're testing today. So we're gonna just do a quick install and put that to the test. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is actually set the torque, and we're going to be we're set right at 180 inch-pounds. there's both set screws at 180. So you can see the seam deformity out of this. Is a heavy duty 22 gauge panel, and you can see the seam deformity right here. With both set screws pressing in from one side, it's pushing all this material to the back wall of the clamp. So next thing we want to do is we want to take these set screws back out as carefully as possible, and then we want to see what the attachment points look like. And basically we're testing their claims that their round point set screws protect the paint finish and that they don't deform the seam, which we already see there's some question about that claim. I just want to loosen these up carefully. A lot of times these round point set screws, they have fine threads, and when they've been heavily torqued, they want to lock up. So I just want to be careful so that we can get this clamp off. Now, in all fairness, this clamp is really designed to be permanently installed, so I'm just going slow so we don't do any additional scratching to the panel. So this area, this is where the two set screws actually push in. And this is, once again, this is a heavy duty. This is a brand new, you can see the rest of the seam. This is how this looked. So once again, this manufacturer claims that they have a special round point set screw that does not harm the paint in any way, doesn't gall the finish. You can see that the paint has been breached right here at the point of contact, and also this seam. Now, some of that might have been, some may have happened during installation, some may have happened while we took the screws out. But regardless, you do have that. There's also a scratch from the clamp body. There's scratches across the top of the seam from the clamp body. And then if you come around to the other side, there's actually quite a bit. So this clamp was installed like this. So this side, all this material was pressed towards this side of the clamp. So you can see the paint is scratched all the way down to bare metal, all the way around the body of the clamp. And the same thing happens on this 22 gauge panel as happens on the 24 gauge panel. As the screws press in from this opposite side, it stretches the metal. And when the metal stretches, the paint doesn't stretch. So something's going to give. And right here you can see these silver rings. That is where the paint has breached all the way around. And there's nothing on this side that covers this area. Where the set screws go in, that area where the paint has been removed down to bare metal, that's still covered by the set screws. But on this side, nothing covers this. So this is exposed to the elements. So once again, this is the S-clamp on a 22 gauge, properly torqued between 160 and 180 inch-pounds as per manufacturer specification.